Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Today y Mañana. I'm Alex. This is Xavier. We're really excited to have you joining us on the show today. As always, we're presented by Emergent Financial Services. We are powered by Cristel Noel State Farm Agency, by Vitae Spirits, by GBS Financial Services, and by CVille Picnic. And of course, we are always partnering with Forward Adelante, the premier Latino networking group here in Charlottesville, Virginia. So it's a chilly morning, but I think a prelude to a beautiful day.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's been a great week, right? Chilly nights and nice, beautiful, warm days. The way I like them.
Exactly. Just the way we like it. So we're going to be joined. We have a great show set up for you today. We're going to be joined by the artist Bob Oller in a little bit, just to talk about his beautiful work. His time in Cuba, his amazing techniques.
No, yeah, the technique and the artwork is fabulous. It really is, and inspiring.
Absolutely. So he's going to join us shortly.
And of course, he captured that island that I love.
That you love so much, the homeland of
exactly
the land of birth for Xavier Urpí, to be sure. So before that, I know we've been talking a number of finance topics this week, between us being on Real Talk on Tuesday, myself on Jerry's show, where all that knowledge bomb blew out, the power in Charlottesville.
Either they shut you down on purpose. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe you're going down the rabbit hole. Who knows? I just,
pull the plug. Alex and Jerry, they just can't stop talking. But we have different topics I think we want to cover today. And some data that you have been.
Well, exactly. And I just want to say, so on Real Talk this week, I think it was Neil Williamson had asked, maybe he had a comment or asked a question, and I don't think we had a chance to really cover that, but he mentioned.
Speaking of Real Talk, just a quick jump in, a happy Veterans Day.
Oh, yes.
To all the veterans.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the distinguished gentleman Keith
Thank you for
Smith
saying
that are out there. So a very happy Veterans Day to all our veterans today.
Yeah, that's so important to really dedicate a day for them.
To thank them for
they
their
deserve
service.
it. Oh, absolutely.
But you were talking about Neil Williamson.
So Neil Williamson mentioned, so there was back in the 70s, right, there was this thing called whip inflation now, right, which was started by, at that point, President Ford. And I think this was around 1974. And inflation was getting out of hand, and he said, we have to take care of inflation immediately. So he said, we came up with this term, whip inflation now, right? So he came up with this big red button that had a WIN, win. Mm-hmm. The issue was that in basically saying that, he mentioned, he alluded to the fact that companies shouldn't be raising salaries at that point in time, right, because it would cause more problem, and that people shouldn't be hoarding. Well, it really had the opposite effect, right? Basically, people said, wait a minute, if they're worried about this, I need to go out and buy more things today before this gets out of hand. Mm-hmm. And literally, it got out of hand, right? Now, just one point between 1970s and today, and the topic I want to talk a little bit about is the inflation today, and I alluded to the fact on Tuesday that I believe that inflation today is quote-unquote manufactured, and I know you said to me, could you explain that? So I will explain by manufactured. I don't mean manufacturing inflation. I just mean it's been created, and it's not an inflation that just happened. It's not an organic inflation. It's external. That's right. It's being created because of decisions that have been made, and I want to take a look at that and say, what does he mean? What does Xavier mean? So I'll point to that. But just going back to 1970, for example, back in 1970, right, the Fed balance sheet was literally, guess. I'm going to throw this at you because I know you don't know really the answer when you talk. But what would you say the Fed balance sheet? And just so you know, so today the Fed balance sheet is $8.5 trillion, meaning Fed balance sheet is that they've bought that many, and I'm talking about the amount of securities that they've bought. They've bought treasuries.
So it's $8 trillion.
$8.5 trillion today. What do you think it was back in 1974?
1974.
I really put you on the spot here.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I think, if I'm correct, it was less than $1 trillion in 2008. So I'm going to be, let's go with...
Zero.
It was zero?
Zero. They hadn't even started then.
Wow.
Right? There's no data there. There were reserves, right? But they hadn't bought anything yet, right? So think about that, and think about the fact that the Fed, at least the U.S. Treasury debt at that point was about $6 trillion. I mean, how many Treasury securities were issued by the government? Today it's, I think, close to almost $30 trillion in debt, right? So think about that in the sense of what the Fed did back then, which was begin to raise interest rates dramatically in order to slow down the economy, right? The impact on the U.S. economy was important, right? It lowered inflation rapidly meaning over 6 months to 1 year. And there was a lot other things going on, but just to pinpoint on this particular point here, right? So they raised rates, but it didn't impact really the Treasury debt in the sense that the amount of interest that they had to pay, yes, ballooned, but it was so small, it didn't impact what we as taxpayers had to suffer because of that, right? Now you go to 2021, right? And we got inflation. I mean, literally yesterday's inflation rate, CPI, was, I believe, 6.2% year over year, right? And I looked at the numbers. So without energy and food, the inflation was 4.6%. So that means that the 1.6% differential came from energy and food prices. That's 25% of that 6%, 6.5%, is energy and food, which is, and we talked about it, which is literally a tax on the people that can least afford, right, to pay for this, right? But let's put this in perspective. And I just used kind of the end of 2019 in order to kind of give a comparison.
I think one of the issues, if you turn to a lot of financial magazines, you're now starting to see a lot of claims, this is normal, don't worry about this, this is great news that we have inflation, it's great news there's supply chain problems, it means there's so much demand that the economy is just booming so much that companies can't keep up. And I think you have some numbers that kind of belie that.
Exactly.
That
and I think that is what they want us to believe, that everything is just going so well that basically we have inflation. But let's start with oil. Oil demand back in December of 2019 was 20.889, and I'm just putting the numbers out there. It's whether it's barrels or whatever, it's just statistics.
It's such a huge number of barrels.
Exactly. So it's 20.889 today. It's 17.4, meaning there's less demand for oil today than there was back just a couple of years ago. I'm not talking about 1970s. I'm talking about a couple of years
before the pandemic when things looked great.
Exactly. What was the price of oil? Today, $80 a barrel. Back then, $54. So it's 48% higher today when the demand for oil back then was 16% lower. So why are oil prices so high? Right?
Well, tell you it's not demand.
Exactly. In other words, that's the point. It's not demand, right? It is supply. It is because we have choked off the supply. Some more information, right? The labor participation rate today. Now, labor participation is how many people are in the labor force that we can count on, right?
Which is an important number because a lot of times you'll see unemployment is your headline number of the labor, how labor looks in this country. So, of course, you always want a low unemployment rate. But the issue is the unemployment rate is the number of people who are unemployed divided by the number of people who are in the entire labor force. But that only includes people who have a job or are looking for one.
That's right.
So if you're sitting out there and you're at home and you're saying, I'm not looking for a job, or I'm so depressed that I can't find the job that I stopped looking, one or the other, or you're sitting at home
or
saying,
I'm being compensated.
I'm getting compensated well enough to stay home that I have no interest in looking for a job. If you're not out there looking for a job, you don't make it into that bottom half, that
the denominator
of unemployment rate. So you could have, if you think about a scenario where, let's say, suddenly half the country stopped working and say, I don't feel like working anymore, just going to stay home. Well, your unemployment rate would plummet.
Exactly.
But it's not because more people got jobs.
That's right.
It's because
it
more
would
people
look
stopped
fantastic,
looking.
but it's a bad number.
But it's a bad number. So labor force participation is telling you of everyone in the country who could be working, how many are looking for work or working. So that's your participating.
Exactly.
So, and that number is
And that number
much
today
lower.
is 61.5, and back in December of 2019, it was 64%. So there was more people in the job market either working or looking for a job, and at that point, than there is today. Right? So of course, the number is lower, not because things are better, but because the denominator is smaller, right? So that's another. Let's look at GDP. GDP in the third quarter, I think they're projecting about 2%, right?
Which is
not very good. The expectation was about 7%, right? So we have here a situation where GDP was 2%. It's not a booming economy whatsoever, and yet inflation is going through the roof, right? Let's look at another number. Average hourly earnings, year over year, down 1.2%. So people are earning less today, right, than they were a year ago.
Which is interesting, because if you look on the news, you'll see wage growth, wages have increased this year and so forth, but people are working, average hourly earnings is telling you people are working less hours.
Exactly.
In total.
Right.
And so you're bringing home less income on average than you did last year.
And if the economy was booming, it'd be the other way around. I mean, overtime will be going through the roof. People will be working extra hours, not less hours, right? Now let's talk about wage growth, because I mean, I know that the government is making this big idea or big push into how well the wage growth has been, right? And certainly has picked up. There's no doubt about it. I mean, when you look at the natter of 2020, of course everything is going to look better, right? But back in December of 2019, wage growth was 4%. At the end of the third quarter, in this third quarter, was 3%. So wage growth once again was better in 2019 than it is today. So everything that we can look at, all the statistics we look at, indicate that at the end of 2019, things were booming a lot better. People were working, supply wasn't a problem, demand was large, and yet there was no inflation. Inflation at the end of 2019 was 2.5%, and today we're looking at 6%. So where is it coming from? That's the key. So in other words, why is it there, right? And one of the issues that I know we've talked about it in the office, and Nicholas reminds us all the time, is modern monetary policy.
Modern monetary theory.
And in this case, what we're looking at is a situation where the concept is, let's put or push as much money as we can into the economic system. In other words, just what we're doing today is create trillions of dollars, just putting it out there in order to create demand, right? But in order to pay for that, we need something on the other side. But we're not necessarily, there's two ways of doing that, right? One is create taxes, increase taxes.
The old-fashioned way is you increase taxes.
And the second one is, let's create inflation, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing. So it's an experiment. I mean, in my opinion, it's an experiment that we are attempting in this country to see how it works. The problem I have is we always talk about the discrepancy between the wages, the rich, and the poor. And we talk about how it's important to make sure that that gap is shortened or that gap is decreased. And yet we're doing things that increase that gap because the poor or the middle class, right, when you jack up gas prices, oil prices, energy prices, food prices, that's a tax of 6%, in addition to the fact that you're going to tax them. The rich, 6% increase, it doesn't bother the balance sheet whatsoever. But to a person who is working hard to bring home, the food to put on the table, to make sure that there's a roof over the head, 6% tax is enormous, and that's exactly what this inflation is. So when I say manufactured, this is what I mean. In other words, this is not an inflation that came about because things are truly booming, and therefore supply cannot keep up with it. It's the other way around. We have shrunk supply demand such that we have a shrunk supply in such a way that the demand, even though it's not booming, it's growing without any doubt, but even though it's not booming, it's causing price discrepancies, and the prices continue to go up. And I think that, decisions have consequences, right? And the decisions that are being made today by, whether it be the Fed, whether it be numerous institutions, is problematic in my opinion, right?
Well, and what you're seeing is it's a classic issue of who benefits from inflation, right? So we know that the average person who needs to go out and buy things does not benefit from inflation. We know the saver who needs to save money does not benefit from inflation. We know that seniors living on a fixed income do not benefit from inflation. Just the amount of money you're getting stays the same, and even if they increase Social Security, they never increase it by as much as inflation has been going up. Let's be real there, right? The things that most seniors buy go up more than the increase in Social Security.
Correct.
Right? So you sit there and say there's only two groups really that benefit from inflation. One is debtors. So if the average, if you're out there and you owe some massive debt, if I owe some massive debt to you that I have to pay you off in 10 years, I love inflation. Because by the time I pay back to Xavier, it's going to be like the dollars I'm paying you back with are worth a lot less to me than the dollars you gave me to borrow.
That's right.
Right? And the second one right now is the U.S. Treasury.
The biggest debtor in the world.
Which is the biggest debtor in the world. So the issue is, and of course the Federal Reserve, despite being an independent institution, works hand in hand.
That's right.
At this point with the U.S. Treasury. They call each other all the time. Right? So you sit there and say the institution whose job it is to control inflation has a very strong incentive on the basis of their friend at the U.S. Treasury to not do so. Because the higher inflation goes, the more the U.S. Treasury can spend in the knowledge that the money it's borrowing, by the time it pays it back, is not going to be worth as much. And so it can constantly borrow money because it knows, well, the money that I'm borrowing is essentially being wiped away. 6% right now. Think about it. If inflation runs at 6%, 6% of the U.S. Treasury's debt, essentially, that's value-wise, that's wiped away. It's the same number of dollars, it looks like on paper, but value-wise, 6%
you decrease
of
the value 6%, and if it stays for 6% another year, so that's 2 years in a row, you decrease 6% and another 6%, which is a compounding effect in this case for them, right?
For them, it's a positive compounding instead of a negative compounding. So the issue that we're having is that the incentives for the people who have the levers of power to reduce inflation are not really there. This inflation is positive for those institutions that have the ability to do something about it.
Exactly.
But for the average person who doesn't have the ability to change inflation or to impact supply, it's a negative. So you have one of those imbalances where even though there are more people negatively impacted by inflation, the smaller group that is positively impacted by it has more access to controlling that inflation or trying to do something about it. So it's not in their interest to do so.
Exactly, and the challenging part here is that when you try something new, right, you don't know what the outcome's going to be. It's not like we're saying, well, we know exactly what's going to happen if we go and try this theory, right? It's never been tested, right, in such a way, in such a massive way that the U.S. is doing. It's been tested in other places which we know have failed, right? So why are we trying to do this? I mean, it's just it blows my mind why we're trying to do something that we know in smaller countries have failed, right? And we're trying to do something that we don't know what the outcome's going to be. But as you mentioned, the more that we continue to borrow, the more difficult it will be for the Fed ever to raise rates in such a way that the debt that now that the U.S. has on their books and has to basically refinance, because it refinances that debt every single year, it never comes down, is going to be much more expensive. And so the more expensive it becomes, the more debt that they have to borrow. And eventually, you sit here and you go, when can that stop? And what does that mean to every person, middle class, poor, that's basically sitting there saying, how can I afford to live, right? So
it's a troublesome thing. So I mean, for the people out there saying, all right, we have this bad news.
Well, so
what's within our power to? Obviously, we can't change inflation, but what's within our power to react financially to what we're seeing?
Yeah, and again, when the Fed says transitory, I mean I think they're faking us out, right? But at the same time, we also have to recognize that there are other events that have occurred in the last year and a half that certainly has put some pressure on the supply chain. So the expectation or the hope is that maybe, right, some things do change, and therefore we don't want to see inflation at 6% every single year or going higher, right? What we want to see is an inflation fine. We had a 6% inflation or a 10% inflation one year, and then it begins to really, wane down. Then one can begin to live with that, right? But as you mentioned, so what does a typical person do? Because people ask this question all the time. What do I do with my portfolio? I mean, people begin to panic. I mean, is the market going to crash? Is this an expectation that things are going to go bad next year? And the answer is, we've touched upon this many times. You can't time the market perfectly, right? I mean, coming into this year, I know many people said, "Oh, this is just going to be not a very good year. Maybe I should get out of the market." Well, the market's up like 20%, right? You may think that next year is like, I don't know, with this inflation, it's going to be troublesome. Maybe I should get out of the market. The market's up another 10, 15%. You can't make that up. That's just an enormous amount. The idea is to always have a diversified portfolio, but begin to shift your asset allocation in such a way that you take advantage of things that would do well during inflation, right? And I know that bonds are still yielding very low, but there's still attractive sectors of the bond market in such a way that you can still earn interest, right? Mm-hmm. And the key is you have to make sure your money continues to grow at a pace that is at least equal to inflation. We're talking at this point about 6%. So if you put that money in cash and nothing happens for 1 year, you've just lost 6%, right? So it's always important to take a step back and say, how is my portfolio doing? Am I well diversified, or do I have too many eggs in one particular basket? Do I have too much money focused in one sector of the economy and therefore it's not going to do well, right? So you're better off saying, I need to make sure that I'm not just buying one or two stocks because I think they're going to do well, right? It's fine to do that, but in a small portion of your portfolio. But the rest of the portfolio, the rest of your investments have to be diversified in such a way that if some things go bad, yes, you're going to be down maybe 10, 15, 20%, who knows? But the rest of your portfolio may be only down 2% or 3%. Mm-hmm. So it survives that, right? And I think that's the key. We talked about it also, I mean, on Real Talk. The idea is not to panic. And we had a conversation on the way here with Nicholas, and he said, it's easy to say don't panic, don't go out there and buy 2 or 3 of these things, but at the same time you go to a store and it's like, there's no toilet paper, what do I do, right? So it's like, maybe I'll buy 2 this time instead of 1 because just in case. That happens. It's human nature, but the concept of panicking and buying just an enormous amount of product because you don't see it on the shelf or you think it's going to disappear creates more of an issue, right? Because it's certainly going to make those prices go up even more for a short period of time. So again, not panicking is important.
And that's the concern, is you don't want inflation to go from something that's external to something that's been absorbed
That's right.
by the market and now is self-perpetuating, where we cause more inflation by responding to inflation. But as if it's external, obviously there are things that can be done. The moment it becomes internal, really the only known solutions to this is to try to pop the inflation bubble by raising rates, which we just talked about the Federal Reserve is not going to do.
Right.
They really have no incentive to do it. And in some ways, they can't do it because the United States debt will suddenly balloon those interest payments on that debt.
Yeah, and too, I mean, they may do a little bit of it, but so we know that they've already started their taper, and taper means that instead of buying $140 billion worth of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, right, they bought $15 billion less, 5 of which was in the mortgage-backed security market, right? And this month they're going to do another $15 billion, so eventually they'll stop buying securities in the marketplace. And the expectation was, well, once they start tapering, interest rates are going to start going up. Well, they tapered in November by $15 billion, and yet interest rates went down, right? Second of all, the mortgage-backed securities, which basically, when you think about mortgage-backed securities, that also is what triggers, how well the housing market's going to do. And there's this thing called the spread between the Treasury and mortgage-backed. Spread means, in other words, if the Treasury 10-year is yielding, let's say 2%, typically in the past, mortgage-backed securities would yield 1 more or 1.5% more. So instead of 2%, maybe 3%, 3.5%, which means that the borrowing cost for the actual person buying a home would have been something like 3.5% to 4%, right? Well, that spread is like 0.67, right? So 67 points is very small, right? And it literally went down. I mean, here's the Fed. It bought $5 billion less, and that spread went down. So it doesn't always reflect what's going to happen.
It's not an automatic lever where the Fed pushes this button and this happens.
Exactly.
It's because the people react, and because the market is a bunch of individuals making their own decisions, which creates a collective movement of things that happen, and that's unpredictable. You can't predict.
You can't predict that. So playing against or expecting something to happen because the Fed's going to do X, Y, or Z, or somebody else is going to do something, sometimes backfires, right? So it's always important to recognize that. Now, does that mean that mortgage-backed securities won't widen or interest rates won't go up a little bit? No, they can. But the expectation is that they'll do what we did back in 1970s It's just not going to happen. There's just no way that the Fed's going to have short-term rates, rise to the 17% level they did back in 1970s when things were completely different. That's just not going to happen today, right? So if they did that, yes, would the market crash? Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, that will be a sign that there's enormous panic out there, right? But it's not going to happen. So the point is, you got to take a step back and saying, how do I position myself to make sure?
How am I prepared for things that may happen, rather than how do I panic to prevent them from
just in case this
just in
happens.
case this happens.
Yeah.
There's preparedness versus panic, which
Exactly.
I think the difference there. Because you can't put on rose-colored glasses and say, well, dude, I'm going to go all in on really risky investments because things are great, it's fantastic. You have to take off the rose-colored glasses and say, all right, I need to make sure that my portfolio is prepared if something, in other words, if the economy begins to decline because of this external pressure. But at the same time, I'm not going to go sell everything, all my stocks, under the assumption that it is going to happen.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with, if you want to take some gains, and if you have some gains in your portfolio, you want to take them, but make sure you buy something that will continue to participate, maybe in a different sector. But to put it in cash, you may be sitting there saying, I'm earning 0, and inflation is 6, so I'm losing 6%.
I'm really
The
earning
real
minus
return
6.
is minus 6, right? So it's something to think about. So, for 1 year, if your return is minus 6, that means that if the market had gone down 6%, you'd be in the same shape. So
Which
you want to make
is
sure.
difficult.
Exactly. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So again, I wanted to make sure that I clarify when I say manufactured, inflation rate, I made it clear, indicating that it's
What
not.
you mean by that?
Yeah, it's not organic inflation. It's something else, right? And so we have to be cognizant of that.
Absolutely. So, makes perfect sense.
To you.
Yeah. Well, to me, hopefully to our audience.
Exactly.
As well, as always, if you've got questions, things you want us to cover on future finance sections of the show, send us a message, send us a comment, let us know. And we'll be sure to talk about it and just continue to share our thoughts, our knowledge on these topics.
Yeah.
And more.
And now to something
better,
right? Something
even better,
joyful, exciting, and creative.
Absolutely. We're really excited to welcome to the show today Bob Oller, an artist, and a beautiful artist at that. Bob, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, no, I remember the first time we met you was when Mission Charlottesville hosted like an art gallery of your beautiful paintings from Cuba. And so ever since then, I said, we need to have Bob come on the show and talk with us. So for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you first became interested in art.
Well, I was going to say, first off, that show was named Changing View. You guys are doing a great job of getting people to look at things differently. And I just, I've been in business all my life, and it is a joy to listen to you guys.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
But back to this stuff, the fun stuff.
Absolutely.
I started creatively early. Actually, a real funny story, if we got a few seconds.
Absolutely.
We were not from a very well-off family, and it was kind of tight to tight. And, my second oldest brother, Jerry, hi guy, he sat down and it was deemed the artist. So therefore, he got the art supplies, and that was all the money was, so that's where it went, And I was interested in art. And I would sneak in, and I would take his tablets and tear a sheet out of the middle of the book. And I would memorize how he had his art supplies set up, and I'd hide, and I would draw, and I'd sharpen the pencil back to the same point and put it back in place. And so for years, no one had any idea. And funny, one of the biggest challenges in money, but also art, is fear, hesitation.
True.
Response, I'm scared or I'm defensive, right? So you stop. Often people stop that are talented stop doing art as young people. I was sheltered in that. I ended up, because I had no money, how funny is this? But wow, wait, I was sitting down and just drawing and not experiencing that fear. It was really, I hope you don't mind me rambling. This is kind of fun stuff.
It's a conversation.
So then, eventually my mom had filled out a class. Okay, do I need to be in? Okay. My mom had followed out, the classes for school, and she had done it in pencil, and I'd realized it, and I wanted to take an art class, so I erased it and put art in there, terrified I was going to get caught. And I had been there about a week and a half, and the teacher pulled me aside and said, "You're a troublemaker. Come with me." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to get caught now. I'm hung.
I'm in trouble.
And she'd take me to a back room, and it was a storage room, and it was full of supplies. And she said, "You're just going too fast. I give you an assignment, you get it done in a day, and it's supposed to be a week, and distracting all the kids, and I'm not going to have this, so get in that room." And
Wow.
she said, "Now there's a desk in there, and here's a key. That's my supplies. You can use any art supplies you want. If you want any information, just come ask me, but stay in there." I'm like, "Got it." Home again. So, I mean, a crazy story, and that's how I got started, I eventually got into commercial art and illustration and design and creative direction and media, but continued to paint quietly. Wonder where that came from. So, and eventually said, "Wait a second, I need to be selling some of this stuff." So yeah.
Now, what I remember chatting with you at the exhibition, and so you actually at first were a traditional artist. In other words, you did watercolor,
mediums.
right? Mediums, different mediums, and then you got into this new technique. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started, but then how you got into this new medium? And it's interesting when you told me, because at first, I thought, computer, what do you do? Copy and paste. That's what I do on my computer, copy and paste, right? But this is completely different. So I think the audience will love to hear that.
Yeah, I would wager the people in the world don't understand how the stock exchange system runs and moves money in the software, and how complex it is with the software. It's that same thing. I started out in illustration. In the creative, I was painting in watercolors and acrylics. I was passionate about drawing and graphics. And so that's where in the fine arts world I started into. But we'll turn the page back. I was getting ready to open a show, and someone said, "We're really fascinated because you always have this creative edge on your advertising commercial stuff." And I got this idea. There's some real fun stuff. I was always pushing that visual in my advertising. How do I tell that story? And so I took a series of illustrations, and I pushed them across the line into fine arts. And part of my show was that, and it did well. In the commercial world, illustration work is done through what they would call a vector-based rather than a photo-based systems, software doing all that stuff, or at least responding to it. Hopefully they're tool sets. People that are really brilliant with money, they use the tools. People that are not brilliant with money, follow the tools, right? So it's always that. That's part of it. But in the illustration world, they have three major programs: Illustrator, Corel, and Freehand. Those are kind of the kings in that world. And what they're designed to do is to truly capture that hand of the artist or the illustrator tightly, clearly, definitively, so that everybody can use it and they can expand it and contract it and modify it. Okay? So that's kind of its root. So logos and simple drawings and illustrations are often done with that. The neat part of that is it has no resolution to it, which means I can expand it really big, and I can make it really small.
You can make the painting as huge as you want.
So now you go to the fine arts part, I can do that, and I can make that painting as big as I want, which is really, really cool. In any tool, it's how well the artist uses it, how they interpret from it. So that's kind of my in the game so far.
So in other words, but it's still like freehand. So in other words, when you go into the computer, you are still, in other words, you're not typing, or you're literally using either I think you mentioned a mouse or a stylus pen. So the computer is reading your hand, your style. So it's as if you're drawing.
It is actually, I am drawing.
You still have to have talent.
The only difference is the computer is the lead. The computer is the brush. The artist is pushing that and handling that and managing that. So I use a stylus in a bunch of my work in the fine arts, and so it's basically capturing. One of the neat parts about that is there's no resolution to it, so I can get big and small. But the other more important part is that if I take that brush away that has a personality based on its makeup and the medium that is setting there, the acrylics or watercolors, they all have personalities, capabilities. In vector work, I'm using a stylus. But there's nothing that stylus does except for just purely capture my hand. And that's where it gets exciting. Because at least if you want to push really hard, all of a sudden everything that occurs in my piece is my hand,
Okay.
my choice, my development. And then as I work on that, there are programs that will give you a palette and you paint from that palette. I don't. I really want to have that control. That's really kind of crazy. An illustrator or an artist that wants control instead of free, but there's an excitement there. As long as I let that creative thing move, it's really, really good. But it's actually vector-based mediums actually build an exact equation of my hand.
Wow.
So exactly what is occurring. So those aren't dots that are being interpreted. It's grabbing my hand.
That's
As
amazing.
I create a color, it's creating that color. So at the end of my paintings, that painting has a palette of itself that it owns. So that
How
movement.
about as an example, we can hold
Oh,
up
yeah,
this one a little.
sure.
Because you were telling us earlier
Tell me what.
how many different colors are in
Oh my gosh.
this painting.
And when you start manipulating that, you can go into millions. Now, in this painting, there's not quite. Is that where are we at? Are we almost
you
there?
go.
I'm going to disappear for a second. This is
Just for a
maybe
second.
more
That's
important
all
to me
right.
anyway.
That painting's great. Don't worry about it.
It looks
See the
better than I
bottom?
do, I promise you. It really does. You have millions of colors, and it's pretty fascinating.
It's just amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
you think of
No, yeah.
traditionally you can't have that many colors.
Yes.
I mean, there's only, from a physical medium in a physical world, there's only so many colors you can put
Yeah.
into a painting. But the idea that you could have thousands, millions of colors
Yeah.
that you can, I guess, slightly tweak and change.
Turn.
It's just amazing.
And that's a process of color theory. I'm going to go off on this, so you
Go
guys
for it,
pull
go
me
for it,
back.
go for
But what we don't quite understand, non-artists, is how color is created and how it moves and where color is. I mean, the center of being an artist is really being able to see. Really looking past just noticing or recognizing, but really seeing what is discerning, visually discerning. What is the difference? What causes that? What does not cause it? And how we teach often is the wrong thing because we teach equations. To draw a face, this is how you draw it. The reality is the way to draw a face is to see the norm and then see what the difference is, because the difference makes you look like you and you look like you. The way a body sets is not like this. It's like this. You will sit down and sit slightly back like this. You're going to be like this. I notice it because that's what I do for a living. But as you go in and you start looking to color, you start saying, what's in that color? What light is in that color? Is it a warm light? Is it a cool light? Is there an earthy tone to that green? Or is there a fluorescent tone to that green? And then what colors create that? So you can start looking at a lot of the colors that I use. I'm sitting down and trying to create a sequential combination as I mix. When you mix colors, I'm going way off here. Bring me back. But as you go off into thes colors, it's actually, as I start building a color, it's the sequence of mixing that color that also changes. If I took a blue and I took a green and put it together, and then I started lightening, and I would be lightening a light blue. But if I was taking a green and a white, I would start lowering its value, the darks and lights. And then I would influence a darker color in there that would have a blue tone to it.
Wow.
It's amazing.
So, I mean, when you think about it, right, I mean, this is a perfect time of the year, right? You look at a tree and it's got all different colors.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you, if you take one leaf at a time, the colors of every one of those leaves are different.
Slightly different.
So it's a medium where you can actually capture more of real nature, the colors in nature, than in the old days, because as Alex said, I mean, you have a palette and you can try to play with it, you mix it and it's not quite right, you mix it again, it's not quite right. Here, with a computer, I suspect that it's a little easier to manipulate that color.
Amazingly
so
enough, in this medium, it is completely, well, one, the theory is important.
Okay.
The understanding and knowledge is important. But these vector paintings are taking 10 to 15 times longer than a traditional medium. But each medium is different. A watercolors has its translucency and the vibrancy that comes from the white sorts to it. Acrylics have a strength and a boldness to them.
Right.
You know, so each medium has a difference. This one has this clearness of its color and this edge that really gives you definition that is just wonderful. So you can really reach into telling a story. But with every medium, you work on the limitations and the powers, and they are usually the same things. So all of a sudden, in this medium, like this, you're working at trying to allow the edge to be appropriate and to find ways to make that edge to disappear.
And you said using the tool instead of allowing the tool to use you.
Yes, and that should be the center.
Yeah.
It really, really is.
Now,
And
tell us.
speaking of telling a story,
I was going to say,
'cause,
that's
this
where I was going. I love that
this
painting.
tells a story, as do so many others from your time in Cuba. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about how you came to be there and the stories that are being told in some of your paintings.
Wonderful. How I got to be there is a dear friend of mine that's been on this show many times, is David Ford. David's just a really great man, and he came to me, and our histories are very similar. We come from Florida, and at that point, we're both outdoorsmen, and so we have a close friendship. And David had gotten asked to go into Cuba. David's a minister, and the bishop of the Methodist Church said, "I've heard, we want to talk," and a team was sent down there, and they kind of tested possibly starting this mission work. And David came to me and said, "Hey, listen, Bob." When he came back, it was like that day, "I got to talk to you." And so I started getting engaged and joining him for that mission work down in Cuba. And one of the wonderful things of that is that its commitment was to go throughout every church inside of Cuba. So that spread is all the way across the country. And as I threw my hat in, they found out I was an artist, and it changed things. It gave an opportunity. They said, "Well, then this is wonderful. So would you teach us?" Like, "I'd love to." "Would you like to talk to artists?" I said, "I'd love to." "Would you like to paint?" I said, "Well, of course." and so that's kind of where it fell to, and I started, and I've been there, 4 times, getting ready to go back to the 5th when that door opens, hopefully soon.
Good.
And so I was able to really get into a lot of different places. The cultural side of Cuba is just unbelievable. They culturally believe that passion and arts and life are really relative, and that you choose to get into that. That's one thing that I just have loved the people in Cuba. And so for me to be able to go down there with my heart open, the things I love, and then to allow that to explode, and that puts me in the right spot to see. And so we ended up. I've been out there quite a few times, and it's really, really great. And and out of that, you start seeing what's going on in front of you. Amazing people. What a love of life, and what just a work ethic, and what a family ethic, and what a cultural ethic. I mean, things can be challenging, but it's what you see.
Right.
It's just really.
Just the incredible nature of the people there.
Yeah.
They persevere no matter what.
They really do. I mean, there's a couple paintings out there, and some of that. There's one that we threw out. Y'all threw out there on the announcements of 2 cups of coffee. The Cafe Cabana was 2 wonderful cups of coffee, and that story was that every time I've been there, we have these ladies at the kitchen that just we're blessed with, and they're really amazing. And then so the last time one of the times I was in a place called Las Tunas. Las Tunas in the northeastern shore of Cuba. And they found out that I loved the coffee. And so every evening after dinner, they would bring me 2 cups of coffee.
2 cups of coffee.
Not a cup of coffee, to be 2 cups of coffee. And then they would bring me this ice cream. The ice cream is it's unprocessed sugar. So there's just a different world. The chocolates and the sweets in Cuba, the sugars in Cuba. It's just, so that just became it. At times, I'm working on another painting of actually rice and beans. And rice and beans, after about the 3rd day, the first time I ever went there, and every time I've been there, I'm going to eat that every single day. It's just what's going to be.
That fills the tummy.
But then I start looking, and I go, well, I'm supposed to be seeing. I'm an artist, right? I should be watching what's going on. Maybe when you're going to places, you should be watching really what people are doing, like the locals. I'm going to spend a second. kind of helping with the teams. We went out. I would always be walking down the street from one place to another, and I would be walking with the locals, and we'd be in the shade, and all my teams would always be walking in the sun on the far side of the street. And I'd let them do that for 2 or 3 days. And I'd say, are you watching? Oh, yes, we are. I said, well, then why are the locals sitting in the shade and you're walking in the sun? but these rice and beans we would set on, and we would. I started looking, and I would notice when they would come in and sit down, there were these beautiful little bowls of pureed mango or pureed guava or pureed passion fruit. Mm-hmm. And everybody would do their things, and they'd graciously sit, and then they would take the bowls and they would start pouring it onto the rice and beans.
Wow.
A little bit of the salsa.
So every night, my rice and beans and their rice and beans taste a lot different than theirs because they were watching.
Because they're watching. I got you.
So, yes. And so that just makes it into the art, into the pieces. Yeah, there's just a bunch of them. Changing Views was one of them, which is really a neat piece. But it was really about, in Havana, that's where they live. That is their yard. So the balconies all through Havana, you see the world happening.
Right.
The streets are the paths, but the balconies were the fun.
Because the weather is such that you want to be outside in the balcony enjoying the outdoors to a certain respect, but that's where everything happens, right?
No question.
Yeah.
No question.
Out of curiosity, so where in particular is that? What is that? The beach, I suspect, right?
This is north section of Los Tunas.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact beach. That beach was, we were sitting on this giant cove, maybe 30 miles long. And there was the 10 or 15 of us that were there. And we played and just had a good time. They said you just need to take a break because our days when we're in Cuba are usually like 6 a.m. until midnight. You're just going as hard as you can, which is wonderful. So they will find a little big moment. So 3 or 4 hours we disappeared and we went up to here, and it was really great. And that big storm was setting in the background on the far side of the cove. And so we played, and then we decided that we'd heard there was a tiny little place on the far edge of that sliver of land you could see. And they said there was some place you could grab something to eat there. And so we got in the vans, and the storm released as soon as we got into the van, and it ran over us. I mean, just came across that bay and just ran over us.
Wow.
And we ran around to the other side so we could look back at the same storm we had been looking at for 4 hours.
Right.
And there's this tiny little bitty restaurant. I'm sure like 5 people went there a day at most, but it was all seafood, and they were kind of scared that we showed up because it was like, oh no, we're not. And we just said, listen, make anything. Please just make anything. And they started bringing out just these layers of food the platters of the vegetables were beautiful. And then all of a sudden crab and shrimp and
seafood,
and lobsters, and it's Caribbean lobsters, and it all just started coming out, and it's the little cafe was maybe 20 by 20.
Unbelievable.
And everybody's sitting outside.
Those hidden gems, sometimes it's those places where it's so small that it's basically an extension of someone's house. It's like they're a personal kitchen, and you end up having probably one of the best meals.
Oh yeah,
ever
you
had.
do.
Exactly.
There's just no question. And there's just there's so many stories. There's so many spiritual stories. There's so many just wonderful.
No, I remember you talked about.
I remember there's a painting there, which unfortunately it's not on one of the ones we have rotating, of the light streaming down of a baptism in the water, like it's in the ocean.
Yes. Do you want to talk about
It was
that?
just absolutely. That's one of my favorite ones. I think.
That's in a place called Pinar del Rio, western section of the country, reasonable high plateaus, the center of tobacco. That's the center of tobacco. And the bishop contacted us and said, I want your team to be the team that works with me. We're doing a baptism down in the Caribbean Sea, South Shore. And we said, sure, we'd love to. This is a very strong, driving bishop that is centered in the Holy Spirit, understands the presence. And he came down there and gave just a wonderful conversation about watching and seeing his hand, being in his presence, and how that moves. But again, I'm going to go back to what you always saying. It's about how we see. It's choose how we see. Do we want to be fearful, or do we want to be prepared? And there's a faith thing that happens.
Right.
So we get down there, and there's literally, you can't advertise things. And there's things that are happening that are good in Cuba. Many good things. There's many things that are not. But guess what? That's where we are at too.
Exactly.
It's kind of how do you see it? And so the powers are like there's extremes on everybody sides. We think there's one person that's an extreme, and it's not. It's what the whole culture is doing. So they pretty much said, just don't make big sounds. We want the churches to open back up. There's a longer story about Castro sitting and having that conversation,
That
saying,
the pastor talked a little bit
yes,
about.
David would.
Right.
And so that is happening. So they just said, just let everybody know you're going to do that, and just don't publicize it. 4,000 people showed up.
Wow.
For an unpublicized.
3,000 on the beach. 400 were baptized that day. As we walked down to the ocean with the bishop, we went out into the ocean. Heavy waves, dark clouds. We started bringing people out, praying over them. Baptism started. The first one got on. These clouds opened up. And these 3 streams of light, 3 I would say,
Right.
fell on us. And stayed there for 400 people.
Wow.
Wow.
And it was just, I did that painting because the bishop asked me to. And we were talking, and he said, Bob, you know how I started? And I said, yeah, you were at the center of the revival of the Methodist Church in Cuba. The churches under communism were closed. Methodist Church down to 8 churches in all of the country, Catholics down to 10. It was just, and he continued. He was out, actually in Pinar, where we were at when he started, and he said, well, you saw the lights at the baptism, and I said, yes. He goes, I want you to do a painting of it. I said, good. He says, I want you to do a second one I'm working on now. And he says, well, you know the story about the 3 young men that came to me and said, we need to start a continuous level of prayer to call for revival. And it's centered out of the Methodist original structure. And he said yes. And so he went out to the church that night. These 3 young men, 16 years old, were praying. They wanted to continue to pray. And he'd went out and they'd fallen, but were still praying, leaning against each other at midnight. They'd been there for 18, 20 hours. And it was in the dark. It was 10, 11:30 at night. And I said, yeah, there was a light that had fallen on them, and there was no light. And he said, yes, Bob, but I've not told anybody. Those 3 beams that fell on us today were the same 3 beams that fell on us at the start of our revival.
That's unbelievable.
It is.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
It's a great story.
It is.
Absolutely.
How can you
Absolutely.
not paint
Yeah.
this stuff?
And that should
To be
like-
able to capture that too.
You're capturing these paintings, yes, something you see, something visual, but which I think reveals a deeper reality. You're capturing stories that even though you can't understand the whole story from the painting, you feel it. Like you can feel that something is happening through your work because you've told a story through this visual
Thank
medium.
you. Do you see what I'm doing then? Thank you. That's just, it makes a difference. It does.
Yeah.
I've got to say I'm blessed that my shows lately have been, people have come in and they said, do you mind if we just stay a while? It's like, oh no, that's good. That's good. But I hope that I tell stories that touch hearts.
And that's the important thing. I mean, you're right. I mean, these paintings, especially because of Cuba, they tell a story. You watch them, and it's a spiritual story too. Colorful, spiritual. You can see the scenery of Cuba. I saw the ones with I saw one where there was an artist painting.
That was me.
That was you. That was really good. I like that one.
I show that.
So
yeah.
it's these are great, Bob.
So
They really are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we keep on trying to throw them out there. If I can find a gallery too that would love to bring some of these up again, it would be great. Or maybe some other new stuff. There's a bunch of
Absolutely.
new stuff. I think we just had an open house at the studio, and my wife made me. She said, well, the studio and the house is kind of a gallery. she said, count the pieces. And I was like, no, I'm kind of, and she'd count the pieces. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sweetheart. Glad you know, smart man. And we had over 120 pieces up in the show.
Wow.
Which is just neat. You
It
know,
really is.
It's- I tend to be pretty prolific, you know, because that's what I'm supposed to be doing, but it was pretty neat.
But even shot you when you're prolific.
Oh, yeah, I was
You
kind of
were.
surprised, yeah.
So if people want to support or get in touch with you, what's
Yes.
the best way for them to do
A
that?
couple of different things. If they wanted to kind of knew where this show could go, or other shows, or a new gallery, or a new pop-up, or, you know, opportunities, boboller.com. That's BOBOLLER.com. There's contact information there, and they can hit it. They can see some of the pieces. Some of the pieces we talked about under a little tab called Cuba
Okay.
are on that website, and that's doable.
Of course, and so easy to remember, boboller.com.
Absolutely.
BOBOLLER.com.
Thank you.
Super simple. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
It has been a pleasure, and thank you
Thank
so
you for your
much
talent.
letting
Thank you
me
for your
ramble.
spirituality.
No,
Thank
we
you
love
so
it.
much.
We love it.
This
This
is
is what we
great.
love,
This
just
is great.
talking
This is
and then just
absolutely
learning.
It's all about learning about the artist and his passion, and that's exactly what you did. Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. No, it was so fantastic. And
Yeah.
it's interviews like this that make me look forward to,
Sure.
to today.
It's a
Mañana,
little
every
piece of
single
history,
week.
right? I mean,
It's history, it's the spirit, it's everything.
Yeah.
All these wonderful things. And just a blessing to constantly come on this show and
Oh, it
be able to
certainly
have interviews like this.
Every week is different. That's what
Every
I said.
week is
Every week we
different.
learn something, and you know, we leave this show a little richer.
Absolutely,
In here.
absolutely. In here. And next week, going to be another
Yes.
fun show we have in store for everyone. We're going to have Keith and Yona Smith
Oh, we do.
from
Okay.
Yes Team Realtors. We're going to return the favor to the distinguished gentleman, Keith Smith. And,
C Realty. No, you
say
can't
it?
say C Realty. That's right.
No,
he'd
it's-
get
it's-
mad at me
yeah,
if
no,
I
it's
say
the
C.
Yes Team. It's the Yes Team
That's right.
Realtors. We can't change it to Spanish.
That's right.
Yes means more than just yes.
Exactly. I
So
know.
so
He made
Keith-
that well aware to me the
On
other
Real
day.
Talk, absolutely. So Keith and Yona are going to join us, talk about their fantastic realty business, how they help people, how they're working to just increase Latino representation.
That's right.
Among realtors. So just it's going to be a fantastic time.
It is. It is.
With them. So just really appreciate that they'll be coming on. Really appreciate you, of course, and all your
Thank
great
you so
insights
much.
and the data, the
I
research
appreciate
you
you
put
too.
in to the opening segment. It really is fantastic. And of course, we appreciate our sponsors,
Especially.
Emergent Financial Services, Vitae Spirits, Cristel, Noel, State Farm Agency, GBS Financial Services, our good friend Johan Torres, and of course, CVille Pitnet. And especially at this time of year with all
Sure,
the beautiful
and
things
exactly.
going on. And so, of course, appreciate you, the audience, and being on this beautiful I Love CVille Network set. Judah behind the camera. Just thank you so much for joining us this week. Be sure to like and share today's show. Any questions, any comments, you let us know. Tell some friends about it. Tell friends where they can find boboller.com and just learn more about, see those beautiful paintings. We've shared some of them on the show today, and I think Nick has shared in the feed. He has indeed shared the link, so you can even just click it. Just click the little picture that you see there. And so thank you, as always, so much for joining us. Really appreciate you, our audience. And we look forward to being with you again next week. But until next Thursday, we will see you. Hasta mañana.